Welcome to LMDtv. I'm Ashwini Vedakan. Joining us on this week's show, we have the founder and executive director to the Center for Policy Alternatives, Dr. Paikiasothy Saravanamuttu. Welcome to the show, Dr. Saravanamuttu. It's good to have you here with us.
Thank you for giving me this opportunity to share my thoughts on the current crisis.
Now, Doctor, you believe in a liberal, democratic Sri Lanka. Do you think the country will ever realize this vision, given the momentum that the peaceful demonstrations have gained in the last 3 weeks?
I am an eternal optimist, and as a consequence, I do believe that we can move towards a liberal, democratic Sri Lanka. And I think that the protests, the Gota Go Home Gamma protests in particular, have added a new dimension to this progression, I think, to a liberal democratic Sri Lanka, in that it is introducing a new political culture. They're determined to achieve their objectives. They are peaceful and nonviolent, and they are emphasizing essentially the basic tenets of liberal democracy, which is about accountability, about anti-corruption, about, people being held to account for all the misdeeds and putting into government and governance, in terms of the structures of both of these things, effective means of ensuring that the kind of plunder and loot that we've had will not proceed into the future. So yes, I do firmly believe that we can become a liberal democracy. It'll always be a sort of a work in being rather than a question of one that has become a liberal democracy as such. Citizens need to be aware, they need to be vigilant, as the protesters in the Gota Go Gamma have shown. And I think we have the basic ingredients, the basic elements for a proper functioning liberal democracy in our country. One other thing, of course, is that a proper functioning liberal democracy will be one in which there will be space, acknowledgement, appreciation, enjoyment, and celebration of the diversity of this country, and where all the peoples of Sri Lanka will feel that they have a place, a stake, both in opinion making and in decision making. That's tremendously important because, in 2015, we had the cry of accountability raised in that election. Accountability in the North and East appeared to be accountability in terms of war crimes, crimes against humanity. And in the South, it was largely about corruption. The two have to be brought together and used as the spearhead for a serious, committed movement towards creating a functioning liberal democracy.
And what is your mantra for good governance and conflict transformation in Sri Lanka?
As I said in answer to the previous question, it is a Sri Lanka in which all the peoples of the country will feel that they are citizens, equality before the law, rule of law. There is this quotation from the Israeli philosopher Avishai Margalit, where he talks about decent societies and civilized societies, where he says that institutions should not humiliate people, and people should not humiliate each other. I think those are two broad general guidelines for constitution making in this country, because the constitution is the overarching law. And I think that is the basic founding principles when it comes to creating a society that is based on good governance and good government. We need to get rid of institutions like the executive presidency, where all power is concentrated in one individual. We need to devolve power to the provinces and move away from where all power is concentrated in the center. We need to come up with strong laws to ensure that we have independent state institutions that provide checks and balances on the exercise of executive power. We need to also bring in strong measures that provide for anti-corruption, and with regard to procurement too, we need proper processes whereby there will not be the abuse of power. Then I think we need to move towards an electoral system which is more representative of people of this country. We need to move towards a mix of first past the post and proportional representation. The ultimate membership of the legislature will be based on the proportion of the votes received by a particular party, but that will be split between the seats that they have won on a first past the post basis in constituencies, and then topped up, if necessary, by seats that they win on a proportional representation-based list system. We need to also make sure that there are more women and youth in Parliament. We need to come up with a quota system which will have what I call a sunset clause. So it won't be there forever, but once that proportion of the population is represented in national politics in elected office, then that requirement in the law can fade away. We need an independent judiciary. We need to get rid of political interference in the judiciary. We need to get rid of the Prevention of Terrorism Act, which has been used against the citizens of this country in amazingly gross and awful ways. It has created so much of suffering, and it hasn't actually prevented terrorism like the Easter Sunday bombing, for example. So there is a list of things I think that can be done. I think whatever government we have next needs to come up with a proper plan of all these reforms and hit the road running and say that in the first 100 days, it will implement as much of these reforms as possible.
Now, Doctor, more than 40 MPs have announced that they would henceforth act independently for the remaining term in Parliament. So the government has lost its two-thirds majority. Meanwhile, the leader of the opposition has reportedly signed an impeachment motion against the head of state. What are the likely scenarios going forward?
Well, I'm not sure that he's signed the impeachment motion as yet, but they're talking about bringing a bill to Parliament calling for the abolition of the executive presidency, calling for a charter of economic and social rights, and I think they might want to include some anti-defection measures as well, as far as that bill is concerned. But there is no consensus yet. I mean, the SJB has to get agreement of all political parties. You're right, the government has lost its two-thirds majority, but that does not necessarily mean that the opposition has got a two-thirds majority, or, for example, that indeed whether the opposition has got a simple majority as yet. So in the next week or so, we will find out what the state of play is, because a two-thirds majority will be needed in terms of the impeachment process and also any kind of constitutional amendments that have to be passed. You know, I would have thought that given the scale of the protests all across this country, the unprecedented nature of the protests, that President Gotabaya Rajapaksa would see the writing on the wall and resign. And that once he does that, Parliament acts very quickly. According to the Constitution, when a serving president resigns, the Prime Minister becomes the acting president. And if there isn't a Prime Minister, it is the Speaker. But within 30 days, Parliament must meet and select one of their members to serve out the remaining years of the term of the president who has resigned. So that can be done. It's not, people sort of assume that there is going to be chaos if the president goes. That is certainly not the case as far as I see it.
And on that note, we'll be going in for a short break.
You love the feeling of being renewed. To stay beautiful every single day. To breathe just like we do. Because you are truly delicate. Protecting the ones who've been with us through the years. With Sayalac Care, the only wood coating that truly protects you. Sayalac Wood Coatings from Jat.
Welcome back to the show as we continue our conversation with the founder and executive director of the Center for Policy Alternatives, Dr. Paikiasothy Saravanamuttu. Now, Doctor, amid forex shortage, the government has resorted to protracted power cuts, import restrictions, bilateral loans and credit lines from China and India rather than opting for an IMF bailout. Sri Lanka has now started formal negotiations seeking financial support from the IMF, reverting the government's earlier stance. What are your thoughts on this progression and what are the measures that the IMF are likely to impose?
Well, I think we have no option but to go to the IMF. We should have gone to the IMF a long, long time ago. So now we have talks beginning, I understand, on Monday or Tuesday between the finance minister, the secretary to the Treasury, the central bank, and the IMF. Now, what will the IMF insist on? I think the first point that the IMF will want to make sure about is that we have a stable government who can honor any agreement that we enter into. That's not an insuperable obstacle, as I have pointed out, but anyway, that's the first point. The second thing is I think the IMF will want to ensure that the servicing of our debt is sustainable and that we will raise taxes, we will curb public spending, we will come up with a proper restructuring with regard to the state-owned enterprises which are making terrible losses. So those are the kinds of things that the IMF will come up with. They would also probably come up with a system for social protection, cash transfers, perhaps to the poor, to the poorest members of the population, in order for them to tide over the current situation. So things are going to be, I think things are going to get worse before they can get better. But in order for us to put ourselves on a stable footing, I think we have to bear that pain and loss. Furthermore, they will talk about raising taxes, which of course this government reduced, and as a consequence, the Treasury lost something like 500 to 600 million rupees. Yeah, so there is, at one level, yes, there is bitter medicine that will have to be swallowed. And we have to make sure that in that process, that the vast mass of people who are indeed the poorer sections of the population are not disproportionately affected, because they've been through and are going through at the present moment considerable pain and suffering.
A final question for this evening, Doctor. With the Central Bank of Sri Lanka being blamed for letting the crisis worsen under its watch, experts are now suggesting an alternative monetary policy regulator and debt reform. What critical social and economic pillars need restructuring to recover from this economic crisis?
Well, the central bank is not solely responsible for what has happened, but it is certainly a key player in creating and sustaining this crisis. And this has come about because of the political interference in the working of the central bank and the monetary board, and their basic incapacity and their basic unwillingness to stand up to the political interference and get on with the job at hand. There are many people in the central bank who are eminently qualified and able to carry out their responsibilities as long as there is no political interference in the work that they are supposed to do. So yes, I think the governor of the central bank, the appointment of the governor of the central bank should be put into the constitution. I personally think that an independent central bank would be a great bonus, a great asset, in terms of our economic activity. And so it's not, we're always going to need a central bank, but what we need is reform, which will protect it from political interference and preserve and promote its independence.
Well, this has been a rather insightful and informative interview. Thank you for joining us on the show this evening, Doctor.
Thank you.
Coming up, we have the latest updates from Sri Lanka's burning issues. Stay tuned. Welcome back to the show, and here's the latest updates from Sri Lanka's burning issues. Year 2022 is seeing shifting anxieties, with COVID-19 being top of the mind as the year dawned, to economic strife and concerns about the spike in inflation being the chief worry a month later, and in the first week of March when the Omicron variant led a spike in cases and fatalities, a turn back to the virus. However, it could well be that with the downward trend in coronavirus cases and deaths as this edition of LMD goes into print, the economy and inflation may dominate our concerns next month. So for the record, 4 in 5 respondents, from 62% in the preceding month to the exclusive LMD Nielsen IQ Business Confidence Index or BCI survey, cited COVID-19 as the most pressing issue for business in Sri Lanka at the time. And unsurprisingly, inflation comes in a close second, with 78% of poll participants versus 72% in February saying it was a cause of concern, followed by bribery and corruption, which was mentioned by 45% of the sample population. On a national scale, the most pressing issue facing the nation at the time of the poll was also the pandemic, according to 77% of participants, versus slightly under 6 in 10 in February. The economy is also among the major worries in business circles, with nearly 7 in 10% citing it as a burning issue, while bribery and corruption continues to irk the biz community. More than 4 in 10% versus 16% in the preceding month say so. And that's all the time we have for you this week. Don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel and follow us on Facebook and Twitter. Thank you for watching, and stay safe.